So today we are going to talk about modern times, and more specifically the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Let us first discuss what do we mean by modern times and how do we apply this term modern times to various cultural eras. Let me begin by saying that in its Latin form, modernus, the term modern was first used in the 5th century to distinguish the Christian present from the pagan Roman past. As you see, the term modern is pretty much as old as Christianity itself. And the first meaning of the term modern is actually Christian. Who would have thought? So modernity is characterized by the transition from the old to the new. This transition from the old to the new is essential to the concept of modernity, starting from the beginning, when the old was referring to the pagan Roman past and the new was referring to the new Christian present. So the consciousness of a new epoch forms itself through a renewed relationship to the ancients. When antiquity is seen as a model to be recovered through imitation, or on the contrary, when antiquity is seen as something to be overcome, like in the case of Christianity versus paganism. In our Christian history, the concept of modernity was usually associated with the Renaissance. But nowadays, it is especially connected with the Enlightenment, with the 17th and 18th century European Enlightenment. The Enlightenment project consisted in the efforts to develop objective science, universal morality and law, autonomous art according to their inner logic. The Enlightenment thinkers developed a secular worldview whose principles were no longer drawn from the Bible or church authority, but whose principles were arrived at independently by reason and social experience. That was the birth of secular culture in the midst of the European Christian tradition. So let me introduce to you some of the key Enlightenment thinkers. We have 6 thinkers here, and I will mention all of the 6 thinkers, but we will focus in today's lecture on 2 or 3 of them. The first one, and we are talking about the top tier, top 3 thinkers. The first, left to right, is René Descartes. René Descartes was a philosopher and a mathematician. By the way, he participated in the 30 Years' War. He was Catholic. He is traditionally regarded as the father of modern philosophy, and he is the main representative of the so-called modern rationalism. The second one is John Locke, a British philosopher who introduced for the first time, or at least he was one of the first European thinkers who promoted the principle of the separation between religion and state. John Locke is widely regarded as the founder of liberalism, and in today's lecture we are going to discuss his views on human nature. The third one in line is David Hume. David Hume was a religious skeptic who proposed that the only way for us to know whether our soul is immortal or not is to rely on the scriptural texts. He thought that it is not possible to prove rationally the immortality of the soul, and he wrote an essay in which he developed some counter arguments against the proofs of the rational immortality of the soul. We will talk briefly about those counter arguments in the end of this lecture. The next tier, the bottom three philosophers, but they are no less significant. This second tier, from left to right, starts with Baruch Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher who is known as the pioneer of biblical criticism. He was one of the first thinkers, both in Judaism and Christianity, who treated the Bible as the book of the highest authority that should be studied, criticized not in terms of rejecting what the Bible says, but in terms of analyzing its content and figuring out who may have been the author of this or that book, and taking into consideration some of the inconsistencies in the Bible. The next one in this line is Gottfried Leibniz, one of the greatest European thinkers of the Enlightenment. Gottfried Leibniz was a philosopher and a mathematician. He invented calculus, and he also refined the binary system of numbers, the binary system that would later become the cornerstone of computer science. Now, Gottfried Leibniz was a classical philosopher of the Enlightenment. He was a devout Christian, and one of his central books is called Metaphysics. In this book, Leibniz was trying to prove that our world is the best of all possible worlds. Here we come to the old problem of theodicy. Theodicy is about how to justify the existence of God, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, with the evil and suffering in this world that do not seem to end. Leibniz was one of the thinkers who was trying to create a philosophy to justify God in the face of evil. But the Enlightenment philosophy in general was much more critical of the Bible, of biblical thought, and of the standard interpretations of the Bible. And here we come to the last one in line, last but not least, Francois Voltaire. Francois Voltaire was a philosopher and a playwright. He was such a star in the 18th century that even during his lifetime, Francois Voltaire was called one of the greatest, and the 18th century was called the Age of Voltaire. Francois Voltaire was very critical of organized religion and of the Bible, although he was a believer in God. And at some point he wrote his famous novel Candide, in which he parodied the belief of Leibniz that this world is the best of all possible worlds. If you've read Candide, and some of Americans actually read this novel in school, so if you've read Candide, you know that this is about a guy whose name is Candide, and who was taught by his professor of philosophy that this is the best of all possible worlds. And in spite of this philosophy, Candide has to go through all possible and impossible evils and sufferings during his life. So the point that Voltaire was trying to make is that this naive and optimistic metaphysics of Leibniz is not that self-evident, and that we should look at the world and at the deeper layers of life in order to understand why evil and suffering actually persist. So in other words, Voltaire was full of irony in this novel. He was full of criticism of traditional religious worldview. And by doing that, he expressed the general spirit of the Enlightenment itself. The Enlightenment is known in the history of Christian civilization as the age of doubt, as the age of criticism, and as the age of new beginnings that are based not on scriptures but on human reasoning. Now that I introduced to you some of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment, let me focus on some of them. And more specifically, when talking about the philosophy of the Enlightenment, we will emphasize four main concepts: the concept of reason, the concept of nature, the concept of liberty, and the concept of progress. We will see how the Enlightenment thinkers reinterpreted those concepts in their philosophy, and we will briefly compare the Enlightenment approach with the traditional Christian approach to those concepts. So we will start with the concept of reason. Of course, the Enlightenment philosophers did not invent human reason. Human reason is one of the characteristic features of being human. And in fact, there are 5 ways to acquire knowledge: sense perception, reason, intuition, tradition, and revelation. In traditional Christian societies, reason, or human rationality, was regarded as supportive of divine revelation and sacred scriptures. Why? Because human reason is limited and divine reason knows better. So therefore, revelation, which is inscribed in scriptures, is much more important in terms of delivering the truth than human rationality, because humans can make mistakes. The Enlightenment thinkers reversed that dichotomy, and they claim that human reason is autonomous and self-sufficient, that human reason is enough for us to discover the mysteries of the universe. The Enlightenment thinkers argued that everything, including scriptures, including the Bible, should be first scrutinized by human reason. Only that way we can make sure that our attitude toward life is fully rational. So let us discuss the famous slogan or formula of René Descartes: I think, therefore I am. In its full version, this formula sounds a little bit different. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Or in Latin, dubito, ergo cogito, ergo sum. So what is the origin of that formula? In traditional Christian philosophy, the starting point of philosophical inquiry was the scripture. So you start with revelation, and you are trying to rationalize the revelation in terms of its legal commandments, its moral commandments, etc. But René Descartes was trying to lay the foundation of philosophy as a science. And every science, every branch of science begins with some axioms or some sayings that are self-evident, that do not need any proofs or arguments. So what is self-evident in philosophy? Descartes asked himself. What is it that gives us a complete certainty in terms of knowledge? Because the certainty, some self-evident certitude or certainty, can be such a foundation. So he thought about knowledge. What about knowledge acquired by sense perception? There is no certainty here because sense perception can betray us. We may see mirages in the desert, for example, or we may see that the sun is revolving around the earth when the sun is rising. So we cannot rely on sense perception 100%. What about reason? Reason, we know, can also make mistakes. And people make mistakes all the time. What about intuition? Sometimes intuition leads us in the right way, but at other times intuition may lead us astray. The same can be said about tradition, and as for revelation, it is usually written by people like us. So, is there any certainty in the world of knowledge? And René Descartes comes to a paradoxical conclusion. If you are trying to find anything that is 100% certain, you necessarily come to a conclusion that there is nothing like this. In other words, doubt is the only certainty that we have. As human beings whose reason is limited and whose powers are limited, doubt is the normal state of being. So doubt is something that cannot be doubted. And for René Descartes, doubt becomes that foundation of philosophy from which he wants to deduce everything else. You know, that may remind us of the famous saying of Socrates, who said, "I know nothing, but other people do not know even that." So Descartes is saying something similar. We all are in perpetual doubt, and that should be our cornerstone of any philosophical knowledge. But what does this mean that I doubt? It means that I exist. Otherwise, who is doubting? I doubt by thinking. But what does this mean that I exist and I'm thinking? It means that I am imperfect. Because thinking, the purpose of thinking, is acquiring knowledge. And acquiring knowledge means lacking knowledge. And lacking something means imperfection. So therefore, the process of thinking already implies that I am imperfect. But what does this mean that I am imperfect? It means that there must be perfection, because imperfection can be measured only against perfection. But what does this mean that perfection exists? It means that God exists, because that's what we mean by God. God is the sum of all perfections. But what does this mean that God exists? It means that since God is the sum of all perfections, he will not betray me and he will not lie to me. And therefore, the world in which I exist also exists as a world. So that's how Descartes is trying to prove the existence of God and the existence of the world. He's doing this by starting with perpetual and universal doubt. This is very different from how traditional Christian philosophers operated, and this technical philosophical procedure reveals to us the spirit of the Enlightenment. The spirit of the Enlightenment is in perpetual doubt. Now, let's move on to the concept of nature. Nature can be analyzed in two forms. First, nature as the universe, and second, nature as human nature. In both versions of the concept of nature, the Enlightenment thinkers reinterpreted this idea, especially in comparison with traditional Christian philosophers. According to traditional Christianity, nature is as the universe was created by God, and God is basically in charge of everything that is happening in nature. Even more than that, God could create miracles, and miracles are something that goes against the laws of nature. At any moment, it seems, God could suspend the usual operation of nature and perform a miracle, like we read in the Bible. The miracle of the burning bush, the miracle of the bodily resurrection, and many, many others. However, the Enlightenment philosophers were trying to put science on a solid foundation. Human reason and science as the product of human reason were the focus of the Enlightenment. And how could you develop science if you believe that at any moment God could suspend the laws of nature? So it seems that religion and science are completely incompatible with each other if you follow the traditional Christian view. So the Enlightenment thinkers came up with a different understanding of nature. They thought that nature as the universe was created by God, but this God is a distant creator. He created the universe and withdrew from the universe. He is observing us from afar, and he does not intervene into our affairs, and therefore the laws of nature are immutable. And since the laws of nature are immutable, the scientists could actually discover them. This religious position is known as deism or deism. Deists are those people who believe in God, but who do not necessarily subscribe to any particular revelation. One of the arguments for deism is that there are many revelations in the world, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, etc. And if God is one, the revelations should have been the same as well. However, all revelations are different, and therefore they may have proceeded from humans, not from God. So that's how deists defended the view about a distant creator. By the way, some of the American founding fathers were deists. Thomas Jefferson, for example. The second part of the concept of nature is human nature. And here as well, the Enlightenment idea of human nature becomes very different from the traditional Christian understanding of the nature of human beings. Remember, we discussed St. Augustine and his doctrine of the original sin. According to this doctrine, human nature, although it was perfect when humans were created, is now irreversibly distorted. Unless you are baptized, you become part of Christianity, then your original sin is being washed away. Still, Christian thinkers would emphasize the evil aspects, the evil inclinations of the human nature. In opposition to that, John Locke developed the idea of a blank slate, or enlightened tabula rasa. According to John Locke, human beings are born with no good or evil inclinations. They are born at the point zero. We gain all our knowledge, all our habits, even some of the traits of our character from education, not from our nature. Our nature is pure potentiality, and it is actualized only through training. Now, generally speaking, there are two schools of modern philosophy, rationalism and empiricism. René Descartes is the founder and one of the main representatives of modern rationalism. John Locke is one of the main representatives of modern empiricism. The difference between the two schools when it comes to human nature is very clear. According to Descartes, when we are born, we are already in possession of some innate ideas. And these innate ideas are being developed when we have contact with the external world. John Locke, on the contrary, believes that we are born without any innate ideas, that we are born at point zero. And the knowledge that we acquire comes only from the external world. So if we use today's computer terminology, René Descartes believes that we are born with some preloaded software. And John Locke believes that there is no preloaded software when we are born. John Locke's theory of human nature, even now, in the 21st century, is one of the standard views of how human psyche operates. It is called psychological continuity theory. And it says that a human being is essentially his or her memories and ability to reflect on oneself, one's overall psychological configuration or pattern. We are going to come back to John Locke and his ideas about human nature when we discuss a contemporary philosophical and cultural movement of transhumanism. The third major concept of the Enlightenment is liberty. So if you believe that human beings are good, or at least potentially good, we all are born potentially good, and if you believe that we should utilize our human reason in order to achieve the best result for our lives and for the lives of our contemporaries, then the next step for you would be to say that we have to make sure that the human society is being rationally organized, and only rational organization would assure humans of their progress. Because human progress depends on the external world, on the world of society. So hence we have to reform, let's say, the educational system. We have to reform the political system. We have to reform the economic system. Only that way we can achieve stable and durable progress. But how can we do that? In traditional Christian societies, the usual political system was monarchy. And the power of the monarch was regarded as something sacred, given to him from God. The Enlightenment thinkers, however, develop a different concept of political organization. First of all, we are talking about political liberty, which is different from spiritual liberty. Now, as you remember in John, in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32, it says, the truth will set you free. And here, John is talking about spiritual liberty as being freedom from sin. However, in politics, the idea of liberty is different. And traditional politics assume the divine right of monarchs that requires obedience from their subjects. So it is here that the Enlightenment thinkers made a real breakthrough by devising a totally different political system that is based on secret elections, different branches of power, and the separation between religion and state. the three pillars of modern republican democracies. Again, secret elections, branches of power, separation between religion and state. Why are those principles so important? In traditional politics, it was assumed that the emperor or the monarch or the king, however you call him, rules based on his divine right. And it is his divine right that makes sure that his rule is good and moral. However, the main idea of modern politics is that when the power is concentrated in the hands of one person, this one person, whether he rules by divine right or by his own right, this person can never stay a good moral person. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That was probably the greatest contribution of the Enlightenment thinkers into modern thought. So they devised such checks and balances that would make sure that no person or no group of people would have all the power within the state, and that there is a constant feedback between the people who elect their representatives and the elected representatives. So secret elections, branches of power, separation between religion and state, these are the characteristic features of what I would call the Enlightenment type political systems. And the first Enlightenment type society was established in the United States because, of course, the kings would not give up their power. Hence, the practical implications of the Enlightenment worldview were revolutions. The first revolution took place in the United States, and it established the first Enlightenment type social and political system. In Europe, we are talking about the French Revolution. Unlike the revolution in the United States, it was a social revolution, not a revolution for national independence. France was already an independent state, but it was a social revolution that transformed the social organization of society. And later on, in the 19th and the 20th century, the American Revolution, the revolution for national independence, reverberated in revolutions in Latin America in the 20th century, the revolutions in Africa, for example. And the social revolution in France later on reverberated in a series of other social revolutions, most importantly in the revolution in Russia of 1917 that resulted in the creation of the Soviet Union. Now let's talk about the fourth main idea of the Enlightenment, the idea of progress. The biblical concept of progress involves the beginning and the end, the story of creation and the last judgment, the apocalypse that will take place in the future. So we cannot say that biblical progress is completely linear. It is linear, but it has an end. And this end is apocalyptic. And at the end, the progress actually stops and acquires a new spiritual dimension. The Enlightenment concept of progress, on the contrary, is based on human rationality, social and political modernization, and reforms in education. And according to the Enlightenment ideas, that will lead to prosperity and happiness for everyone. Everyone will live happily ever after. So I think that is probably the most vulnerable idea of the Enlightenment, because 20th century actually showed that we are as far from prosperity and happiness as we were before the Enlightenment. 20th century saw the First World War, the Second World War, the rise of totalitarian regimes, left regimes and right regimes. The 20th century saw mass murders, the Gulag, Auschwitz, and after those horrors, it is really difficult to believe that when people are completely rational, they can actually agree with each other and live with each other in harmony. Now, as you see already, when we summarize the teaching of the Enlightenment, when we focus on nature, reason, liberty, and progress, in all those four ideas, the Enlightenment thinkers proposed a worldview that is first secular, which means is not drawn from the Bible, from the revelation. And in terms of religion, the Enlightenment worldview is at least alien to religious ideas, at best alien to religious ideas, and at worst simply opposes religion. So therefore, for traditional religion, Christianity, as well as Islam, as well as other religions, for all those religions, after the Enlightenment, after the 18th century, after those ideas of the Enlightenment becoming more and more popular, spreading all over the world, those religions were facing the task of adjustment. How can religion adjust to a completely rational worldview proposed by the Enlightenment and not lose its own unique appeal and teachings? Now, every religion is composed of two components: sacred scriptures and sacred tradition. Sacred scriptures are the backbone of any religion, because sacred scriptures come from the figures who are considered sacred, and therefore sacred scriptures are usually considered infallible. Sacred traditions represent the series of interpretations of scriptures, because scriptural texts are usually broad enough and call for various interpretations. So sacred traditions may clarify certain things that are not clear. They may interpret or reinterpret certain things from scriptures. They may complement, they may add something to sacred scriptures, but in theory, they could never contradict sacred scriptures. So that's how religion develops. The sacred scriptures represent the foundation. Sacred tradition is the instrument of religious evolution. So when religions were facing the situation with the Enlightenment, it was obvious that they should somehow transform their interpretation of scriptures, that their sacred traditions should evolve. And here we have two basic responses to modernity. We will talk about Christianity: the liberal response and the fundamentalist response. The first people who responded were the American first theologian in the Calvinist tradition, author of the classic treatise concerning religious affection. It was Jonathan Edwards. His image is on the top of this screen. Jonathan Edwards in the United States, and Friedrich Schleiermacher, also a Calvinist theologian, but from Germany, a German pastor and theologian, the author of On Religion Speeches to Its Cultural Despisers. His photo is at the bottom of the screen. So what happened with Protestantism, and how did Protestants adjust to the Enlightenment? In its liberal form, Protestantism joined forces with the historical optimism of the Enlightenment. and it developed a renewed sense of purpose to missionary Christianity. Jonathan Edwards, who was the pioneer of this approach, reconciled Protestantism with the Enlightenment by locating religious understanding not in the intellect, but in the emotions. And here it would be exempt from the empiricist criteria of truth. When it comes to emotions like love, awe, adoration, etc., the empiricist criteria of truth, experimentation, etc., will not work because those emotions are inside us and we don't need any proof of the reality of those emotions. Now, Friedrich Schleiermacher in Germany basically has done the same thing. He defined religion in terms of feelings, as the feeling of absolute dependence. Feelings rather than reason, hence piety and progress, could coexist rather than conflict with each other. Now, Protestant liberal theology in the United States was opposed by the fundamentalist movement in American Christianity, also here in the United States. Fundamentalism arose in the US in the early 20th century as a response, a reaction to historical critical approach to the Bible. Fundamentalists believed that liberals went too far, that they betrayed the scriptures, and therefore that true Christians should come back to the scriptures and not even to the scriptures as simply books of wisdom, but to the scriptures as books that make no mistakes. So back to the fundamentals of the error-free scriptures. According to fundamentalists, scriptures should be treated literally. The Bible means what it says what it means, and the most important work for Christians is not to participate in social and political progress, but to evangelize people, to make them saved, because this world, the world of matter, is of less importance than the world of the spirit. And it is about the world of the spirit that Christianity should be concerned. Now, let me add to that those two basic responses, the liberal and the fundamentalist response, are available to all religions. For example, Catholics showed that they are capable of both responses as well. So Catholics had two Vatican councils. The First Vatican Council took place in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. And back then, Catholics took a very hard stand toward the Enlightenment. They criticized the Enlightenment in general, they criticized capitalism, they criticized socialism, they criticized moral decay, etc. So they completely rejected the project of the Enlightenment, and they were trying to go against the current, so to say. However, in the Second Vatican Council that took place in the second half of the 20th century, Catholicism decided to liberalize. And since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholics actually developed a much more friendly, liberal, and ecumenical and interreligious approach to the Enlightenment ideology and to other religions. The same is true about Islam. Many people think that Islam is a different religion and therefore it can never be reconciled with modernity. However, we have Turkey, that was a republic for many decades and is part of NATO. So it all depends on how religion reacts to the Enlightenment itself, whether it decides to liberalize itself or whether it decides to go a different fundamentalist way. And finally, as promised, we will conclude this lecture with a brief overview of David Hume's arguments against rational proofs of the immortality of the soul. And in his essay on the immortality of the soul, he is developing a series of counter arguments to Plato and to religious thinkers and to thinkers in general, a series of counter arguments in which he actually questions traditional rational ways to prove the immortality of the soul. David Hume's arguments are divided into three categories. First, metaphysical arguments. And here he is trying to criticize Plato and Plato's arguments for the immortality of the soul. Hume's metaphysical arguments can be summarized as follows. Number one, thinking and feeling by itself does not necessarily imply that our soul is immaterial and immortal. For example, we know that animals feel, and animals also may think, of course, not as grown-up humans, but as children. They can understand certain things. But does this mean that the animal souls are immortal as well? The second argument, belief in humans being immaterial substances does not necessarily entail the immortality of the soul, because the soul may expire in the spiritual world. So the thinking is that in this world we observe that everything first begins its life and activity, but then ends its life and activity. So why do we think that in the spiritual world the situation is different? Yes, the human soul may survive the physical body, but it may exhaust its potential in the spiritual world. And finally, the third argument, even if immortality exists, it may not be worth desiring. Now, that is a very emotional argument, and frankly, I disagree, because we do not know what immortality we may be offered by God. So it may be very worth desiring, indeed. The second category of David Hume's arguments, moral arguments. Here is the summary of those arguments. Number one, belief in God and God's justice does not necessarily imply the immortality of the soul, because the human notion of justice is apparently in conflict with the divine plan. So yes, there are many things that we probably will consider just, but will not happen on this earth. And there are many things that we consider simply unjust that are happening on this earth. And since God is in charge of what is happening on this earth, God's plan and God's idea of justice may be in conflict with what we believe is justice. Number two, if humans are immortal, why is our present knowledge confined to the world of perception? So if we are immortal, why not show us at least a glimpse of the future immortality? I think this argument may be questioned today in view of near-death experiences. Number three, if humans are immortal, why are they so weak in the present life that many die young? Well, yes, many still die young, but I think that does not necessarily mean that we will not continue our life after the death of our body. After all, when we are in the womb of our mothers, we are very weak. However, we are born, and when we are born, our weak body is being developed, and we become mature and strong. Number four, if humans are immortal, why do we fear death? I think that is a very profound question, because it seems that if we are immortal, our subconscious intuitively knows that we will continue after the death of our body, and yet we do have fear of death. Here we may offer various interpretations and various explanations of that, and I think most of them will be psychological. And finally, if humans are immortal, why do women look inferior to men? Of course, this is a foolish argument because now we obviously know that women who may have looked inferior to men back in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, are not inferior to men at all. It all depends on the level of education. Now that women can enjoy the same level of education as men, they not only do not look inferior, but in fact they are in many cases superior to men. And finally, the third category of David Hume's arguments is about empirical arguments. So first argument from analogy. First premise, human body and mind are closely interconnected. Second premise, as we age, our body weakens and dies and disintegrates. Conclusion, hence our mind or soul should also disintegrate. And the second argument from analogy, simply two quotations from David Hume's essay. I quote, "Judging by the usual analogy of nature, no form can continue when transferred to a condition of life very different from the original one in which it was placed. Trees perish in the water, fishes in the air, animals in the earth. Therefore, what reasons then to imagine that an immense alteration, such as is made on the soul by the dissolution of its body, and all its organs of thought and sensation can be effected without the dissolution of the whole?" And that will conclude our today's lecture. Thank you for watching. See you next time.